So we'll start with a quick introduction. I'm Josh. I'm a sophomore. I'm an accounting major, and I'm also on the comps committee of MCG. And then I'll let Tom introduce himself.
Yeah, I'm Tom. I'm also a sophomore, majoring in accounting at MIS, and I'm on the education committee.
Yeah, today we're going to go through implementation risks and mitigations. So quick agenda. I'll go through the research and implementation to start off, and then Tom will finish us off by talking about the risks and mitigation. So going into research for both implementation and risks, there's the 3 steps right here: gather, research, analyze. So for gathering, where you're getting your information, there's 3 main sources. Your case prompt has a lot of good information for you. Most of the information you'll need will probably be in here, but when you need external sources, you can use Google to find client documents. Go to websites, find specific information about McDonald's or even about their competitors if that's something that's important to your rec. And then statistics, it's always important to have those. It really helps to back up whatever you're saying. No matter if it's implementation, risk, or even for your recommendations as a whole. For research, look into the client industry. For McDonald's, it's great to look at Burger King or Wendy's, and if they have similar things going on with their company compared to McDonald's, it could be a great way to kind of figure out how the implementation plan could look, or maybe some of the risks that go along with the rec, but we'll get more into that later. Another thing, breakdown of the recommendations implementation-wise. As we get more into the implementation plan, we'll talk about that as well. But the client industry will have a lot of information about how long it averagely takes for specific things to go into place, but it's important to think about it as well. And then for your risks, for your obstacles that you may face when implementing ideas, once again, you can look at the client industry as a whole, see if anyone else has done this. If so, you can kind of base it off that, or just think logically through your recommendation and try to see if there's any holes that you can find. And then for analyze, for implementation, you want to make sure it's possible. Don't give us an implementation plan where it's not possible to do it in the amount of time that you're saying. But once again, we'll get into that later. Evidence of support for the best plan. So whatever you end up choosing, make sure that you can back up why you chose it, why the time amounts are just the amounts you have. You don't have to go too specific, as in like a year and a few days. Like if you say a year, that's enough. But just make sure that whatever you're saying does have some sort of proof behind it. And then show how you considered any hole of your recommendation. That's your risk right there. Make sure that any major hole or anything that could really rip your recommendation apart that you address here. But going into implementation plans, this is your roadmap of recommendations. So there's a few key things we have on the left here that you should include. First, detailed breakdown of activity. So what short-term things do you have and what long-term? You might have one project that's only going to take 2 months, but another one that will take a year. Make sure that you show us that in some way, because it's really helpful in seeing that you don't overload the company. If you pick 3 long-term projects, it might be too much for McDonald's to handle. And then at a certain year, they might just not have enough funds or not enough resources overall to do it. So by spacing it out with some short-term and some long-term projects, you can really make your recommendation better. Cost and projected revenues. If there's any major costs or revenues that you have associated with your recommendation, be sure to show them here. For example, if you're creating a factory, which obviously for McDonald's, this wouldn't be a recommendation you'd be using, but we're just going to use it as an example for now. If you're creating a factory, you'd have that initial cost when you're paying someone to build the factory. So that's going to be a pretty big cost for your company. So you're going to want to put that on your implementation plan. And then if you're expecting to have to pay workers, you could also put that on there. Any really big costs is kind of what you want to show. Consistent time breakdowns. This is a very important thing. Don't go, by months and then into years. Don't make it different for each one. Even if you might have something going on in September of 2020 and then maybe something in December of 2020, don't have uneven things. Put it all as years. You can put this all in 1 year. You can break it down by quarters. Just make sure whatever you're doing, you're consistent throughout. Expected difficulties. If there's anything that you really think might go wrong, make sure to put it on here. Or if, maybe you're going to buffer in more time just in case. Maybe it usually takes a year to build a factory, but you're going to give a year and a half just in case any difficulties. Show that in your implementation plan. And finally, your check-ins or maintenance. Once again, going back to that factory example, after you build the factory, you'd have to maintain the equipment. So how often are you going to do that? Once a month, once a year? Show that somewhere in your implementation plan, even if it's just within 1 year, say, start monthly maintenance. It just gives us a better idea of really what's going into the rec. So then on the right here, having a client-centered implementation, the 3 main things. You want impactful, relevant, and feasible info on there. Impactful and relevant are somewhat similar. You just want something that's really applicable to your recommendations, and that's really, making an impact on the company. For example, that factory is obviously a big cost, but if it's something really minimal that doesn't really go into, it really isn't that important implementation wise, you don't really need to include it as much. And feasibility for that factory, for example, you couldn't really build one in a month, but you maybe within 2 years you could. That's kind of where you start looking at other using sources like either your case or going onto Google and looking up how long it averagely takes to build something like that. And you can use that to really build out your implementation plan in a way that makes sense. So right at the bottom there, incorporating research. The biggest place to get information is really from competitors. So here it says the ideologies like the Porter's 5 Forces. For those of you who don't know, Porter's 5 Forces is really focused around competition. So the 5 parts of it are buyer power, supplier power, threat of new entrants, threat of substitutes, and just current competitors. You don't really need to worry about that as much. I would focus on just competitors as a whole. And if you see that, for example, for the McDonald's case, if your recommendation is very similar to something that Wendy's has done, you could use their timeline or however long it took them to put this into place for your recommendation. Just be sure that your recommendation is a bit different from theirs, because if they have something, you're not going to really get that advantage from it. But looking at those comparable companies can really give you a good idea of how long specific things can be put into place. But if they don't have the exact same idea that you might have to use some common sense to actually get to that part. That's where the bottom part kind of comes in. Dissect each recommendation into milestones. For the factory example, going back to that again, maybe you have a milestone when you initially set buy the land, and then a milestone when the factory is done, but there's no actual machines in it. And then another milestone when machines are in it. So that we can see exactly your thought process of the times. And we can see exactly, okay, you might have that factory after 2 years, but it's not actually operational until year 3. Make sure to include as much information you can, but we're gonna go more into how you can kind of show this information right here. These are 3 different type of timelines you can use: a Gantt chart, an arrow or classic timeline, and a table. And we're gonna go through each of them in detail right now. So for the Gantt chart, it really shows the duration of each task well. As you can see from the example there, the light blue, you can easily see which parts are taking how long. You can see that for the dark green section, there's a really long one at the end, but then there's a shorter one before that. So you can easily see when it's starting, when it's stopping, and it's pretty easy to visualize. And it's aesthetically pleasing. For the cons, it can be pretty time consuming to create, especially if your recommendation is really detailed. If you have a lot of steps in each rec, you're gonna have to show exactly the times for each of them, which can take a lot of time to create. But this could be a really good appendix slide because it has a lot of information on it. So if you do end up getting a question about your timeline and you can flip to this, you'll be able to easily answer the question, and it will show that you really thought about this before you were making the rec. For the arrow or classic timeline, this is what a lot of people end up using. It clearly goes from present to future, and it's aesthetically pleasing, but you can't really show task duration. For example, you can see in Q1 2019, you can't show if it's only occurring within this quarter, you couldn't show that it takes 2 months. You could say that Q1 2019, you start something, and maybe Q1 2020, you stop something. But unlike the Gantt chart, there's not a clear line showing that. You'd have to read both of them and kind of correlate. So that is one kind of con to it. And the other one is you may run out of space on your slide, depending on detail. With the Gantt chart, it's kind of broken down in a way where you can kind of fit a lot more in because it's just one bar and you just put kind of what the overall category is on the left. So on the left for that Gantt chart, it would say maybe building a factory, and then you just see the overall time it would take. But for the arrow and classic timeline, you'd have to put Q1 2019 task 1 would maybe be starting a factory. But if you have a lot of different things happening then you're gonna have a lot of different tasks at that point. And you're gonna have to show all these details, which can lead to just the slide being way overcrowded. What you can do is have a very simplified timeline, which is your really important information on your main slides, and then include a Gantt chart or a table, which we'll get into soon, in your within your appendix. And by doing this, you'll be able to show us in your actual presentation the main points, the main important implementations that you have on your timeline. But then if we really have more questions, you'll be able to easily show, okay, well, we did develop the Gantt chart, or we did make this table, and we can show you exactly how much time each task is taking. And that's a great way to deal with questions. So, but then table, the pros, it shows a pretty detailed timeline. As you can see, you could break down each task, specifically their start dates, end dates, duration, everything's laid out pretty easily. And it's pretty concise. You don't really have a visual to it though, and that's where the con kind of comes in. There's no really visual representation with this table. And this could be a problem with some things. For example, if you look at task 3, it takes 2 years, which means that task 4 is actually occurring at the same time as task 3. But when looking at the table, you don't really see that. You wouldn't really think, oh, this is taking place over 2 years, while task 4 is taking place, it starts after, but it also ends before task 3 is done. So it can just get a little bit confusing to look at. Whereas a Gantt chart or a classic timeline, you can really see, you can easily just look at it and see exactly when things are starting and ending, where tables can't really see that as much. And you also can't show single time events. For example, a launch. We're going to do an example soon, and you'll see that we use a table for it, and it leads to a problem when it comes to a launch, but we will get into that later. So here's the example problem. So it's create an implementation plan for this recommendation. Popular deli in a small town is looking to expand to capture growing demand. Since their deli has developed a strong brand, they're thinking of opening a pizza place sister location to diversify their offerings. Your team assessed the idea and are recommending the expansion. How would you implement this expansion while considering the risks and goals of the client? So the process we would recommend is to consider the specific steps, then research it, and then order the steps. So I'm going to kind of leave it open to you guys. If you have any steps that you think you'd have to consider to make this happen, feel free to leave it in chat or unmute yourself and say it. We're going to do a little bit of an interactive part for this first step. If no one has any ideas, we can move on, but I want to kind of leave it open for you guys to try to figure stuff out. So let's go to what we came up with. So these are the specific steps that we thought would be necessary to make this happen. First, securing funds. So how exactly are they going to raise it? The implementation of this is actually a separate part. Are you going to have to spend a year before getting these funds? Or for a company like McDonald's, you probably won't. You'll probably have the cash already where you won't have to worry about it as much. But for a small deli, you're going to have to think about where you get your funds from. So that's a part of your implementation that you always have to keep in mind. Luckily, you have a big company that you're working with, so you're probably not going to have to worry about this. Researching and choosing property location. Once again, this all goes into just overall the property. You need to think of where you're going to put it at first, and then how are you going to purchase the property. That also comes into your costs. How much is it going to cost? And you got to think about this all for your implementation just to see, do you think it's going to take a year to find a location, or do you already have one picked out and you only need a month to buy it? Purchasing the property, once again, once you find the property, can you buy it right away? Are you going to have to negotiate deals? Is it in an area where a lot of other people are trying to buy it? You're going to have to consider this as well. Marketing, are you going to be doing this before the launch of the pizzeria or after? How long are you going to market it for? If you're doing it marketing before, you're going to offer some sort of coupon that's going to be sent out monthly. You got to consider this as well. Property renovations, after you've actually purchased the property, do you think you're going to have to renovate it? And how long is that going to take? That's another important thing to put on your timeline. Hiring and training new workers. This would be around the same time as those renovations. You would need qualified workers to make pizza. Since you're a deli currently, you wouldn't really have the same workers with the same skills. So you'd have to look at the training process. How long is it going to take? Overall, is it going to take a full year to train these workers, or are you going to be able to have a quick turnaround where you can hire the workers in and open soon after, and then that store opening is your final consideration. So for step 2, you would research how long each step would take. For this, we're not really showing the process, but at this point is when you'd go into Google or go into the case and really see, okay, well, we need to see how long it takes to hire and train pizzeria workers. So you would either look in the case and see, oh, okay, normally it takes, 2 months or however long it takes. Or you could look onto Google and see, on average, are there a lot of pizzeria workers that you're going to have to train? Could you just hire someone who already has the skills and then have minimal training? That's something you would decide as you went through your recs, but when you go into your implementation, you'd have to include this. And finally, step 3, order the steps and create a visual. So here we made a table. As I said before, the one thing missing from this table is that launch, which is a very important part of your implementation, because if you never launch the pizza place, you're never going to actually get any revenues, and your whole recommendation doesn't really have a point. So on here, you can see it doesn't say that at all. that's the biggest kind of drawback of this table format. It might be better for the people who are doing this case to use a Gantt chart or a regular timeline, just so they can show at the end, launch the pizzeria, maybe at end of March or beginning of April. It really depends on the recommendations and how long you think each thing would take. But through this, you can see that each other task had a specific start and end date associated with it. Durations are planned out, and this would all be from the research you did in step 2. I'm now going to pass it over to Tom, and we're going to go through the potential risks.
Thanks, Josh. So moving into like the risks and mitigation section of the presentation, the first step, of course, is actually determining the potential risks. And one thing a lot of people mess up here is that they'll choose a very basic risk that will apply to multiple recommendations. So we listed a couple of examples here: high costs, low revenue, investor buy-in. All of these are examples of risks that aren't very specific and could apply to multiple recommendations, so they aren't very good. Instead, the main thing with risks is it's important to hone in on the specific issues that actually apply to your recommendation. So we listed some potential groups to consider here. First is tech considerations. If you're implementing new technology, is there the possibility that this will become obsolete in a few years? Is there the need to have good cybersecurity with it? So there's some things to consider: internal and external impact. If you need to hire new employees, are you going to have to train them? If you're involving a recommendation that is international, is there going to be a language or a cultural barrier with your partner? Right. Likewise, federal regulations. Are there tariffs or trade policies with your recommendation that need to be considered? The exchange of big data between countries, that can be complex. And this last group here, I think, is especially important for this case, given the idea of design thinking, social reactions to your recommendations, right? If you're implementing something new, how is the average customer going to look at this? Is it going to fit your brand image? Work process into a new country, is that going to be ethical? So these are all things that are very important to consider when determining the risk. But the main takeaway for choosing a risk would be to make sure you hone in to a specific issue that applies specifically to your recommendation. So moving on, the next step would be to assign impact, and this is best done through a risk matrix, which you can see here. On one axis is the probability, on the other is impact. So it's designed nicely here. The green is sort of a low level risk, low probability, low impact. Yellow is that middle area with a medium probability, medium impact, and then red is that critical area. And in general, you're going to want to avoid having any recommendations fall into here if possible, right? But that when you're assigning impact to these risks, again, there's some things you can consider, like how much would this cost your company if this risk were to occur? How much would it affect your profit, right? If this risk were to happen, how easy would it be to bounce back from it or to mitigate it? Is it something that's going to affect you long term, or is it something that would only take a couple of months to fix? If it's applicable, the technical performance impact of the risk, right? Finally, depending on the situation of the company, this recommendation doesn't pan out, is your company going to survive? Is this something that's very vital to the company? So these are all things to consider when assigning impact. And another thing I'll say about the risk matrix is, usually this isn't going to be going on its own slide. These graphs here are best placed alongside the risks and mitigations all on that one slide. So they're not essential, but they're really good ways to kind of make that slide more detailed. Onto the next slide here, mitigation strategy is of course the steps that you're actively going to be taking to prevent that risk, right? And another thing that people really mess up a lot in this section is that their mitigation will simply be saying that the risk won't happen, right? And that's not a good mitigation strategy at all. Just like your risk has to specifically apply to the recommendation, your mitigation is going to have to specifically apply to the risk and outline the steps that you would take to help recover from that. So we gave an example here of a good mitigation strategy for an Under Armour case. So let's say you're recommending that Under Armour create flagship stores in China to increase brand recognition. A risk with that would be that there'd be unpopularity within these new stores when they're originally opened. So to mitigate that, we specifically outlined steps that one would take to combat this risk, right? So the mitigation would be that we leverage current partnerships with athletes like Steph Curry. who are popular around the world that would attract customers, right? So again, use the mitigation to directly combat the risk. And additionally, it's helpful to have a mitigation that's already within the company's arsenal. So in this case, Under Armour already has partnerships with Steph Curry and other athletes. So, the mitigation isn't like a whole new separate recommendation within itself. It's something that we already have at disposal that we can use. So moving on here to the next slide. Here we use the same example from before, this time just sort of outlining the entire process. I could reread it here quickly. A popular deli in a small town is looking to expand, capture growing demand. Since their deli has developed a strong brand, they're thinking of opening a pizza place next door to diversify their offerings. The team assessed the idea and are recommending the expansion. How would you implement this expansion while considering the risks and goals of the clients? So the first step, of course, is to identify the risks. We have 3 written down here that are all specific and all would address potential problems. So customers in the area don't prefer the pizza. There's also the fact that running 2 restaurants can dilute the original restaurant's quality. And finally, there's the risk of inefficient communication between restaurants. So again, these are all good risks, very specific. No one risk could really apply to any other recommendation, so that's important. Next step here is to assess the probability and impact of the risk. So for the first one, the customers in the area don't prefer impact. Of course, there's a low chance that in any given area, customers won't like pizza. Obviously a very popular product, but if this were to happen, it would have a high impact because this is like their entire business, right? So on to the next risk, running 2 restaurants can dilute the original's quality. There's a high chance of this happening. Obviously, when you open another restaurant, you're going to need more employees. You're not going to be able to focus on that singular restaurant as much anymore. If this would happen, it wouldn't be the end of the business, but obviously it would, still be pretty big, which is why it's medium. So in the risk matrix, this would probably be in that yellow area, upper yellow area. Finally, inefficient communication between restaurants. Again, there's sort of, a medium chance of this happening. When you open 2 restaurants, obviously you can't focus on one as much, but if this were to happen, obviously it wouldn't be the end of the world. It wouldn't be that big of a deal. So on the risk matrix, this would probably be in that green to yellow area. So now that you've identified risks and assessed the probability and impact of them, the final step, of course, is to determine the mitigation strategy. So for that first risk, the risk that customers might not prefer pizza in their area, a good mitigant to that would be to use demographic analytics in order to determine, which location has the best taste for this sort of food. For the second risk, the fact that running 2 restaurants could dilute the original's quality here, hiring more staff, and making sure that the product isn't being slowed down or whatever would be a good way to mitigate this risk. And finally, for inefficient communication between restaurants, implementing a POS system to integrate technology across both locations would help ensure that there's good communication between the 2 restaurants. And again, with all these mitigations, none of them are too complex. None of them are, high budget. They're all things at the company's disposal. And that's very important in ensuring a good mitigation strategy. So overall, if I were to kind of sum up the risk analysis process, just make sure you choose a risk that is specific to your recommendation, and then choose a mitigation, which is likewise specific to that risk, and actively take steps to help mitigate that. So that was our presentation on implementation plan and risks and mitigations. If anyone has any questions, feel free to just type in the chat, or you can unmute your mic.